Hello and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. Today's lecture will cover the period from 1860, the election of Abraham Lincoln, to the very fraught election of 1876. The main themes are going to be the Republican triumph of the new party, only established a few years earlier under Lincoln in 1860. Followed by the secession of the South and the Civil War, and also a major legislative drive by the Republican Party. They were able to pass much of their program with the South out of the action. This is going to be followed by the Reconstruction period, where we have a series of very close, fraught, and starkly divided in terms of region elections, and a very close division between the Republican and Democratic Party. And then also talk about problems of political corruption seen very clearly in several heated elections, especially that of 1872. So a little bit before the period covered in the last lecture was the Democratic victory with James Buchanan in 1856. Buchanan won with only 45% of the popular vote because we had the new Republican Party. The Whigs had collapsed. And you had the American or Know Nothing Party, a nativist party that wanted to restrict immigration during a period of very heavy Irish and German immigration to the U.S. Former Whig President Millard Fillmore represented the Know Nothing or American Party and got 21% of the vote, although he only won one state, that of Maryland. Whereas John C. Fremont, the Republican candidate, won most northern states, but Buchanan won fairly handily in the Electoral College, taking all of the South and many of the, most of the border states and a number of northern states as well. Buchanan is often ranked as the worst president. Partly this is an issue of the unresolvable political issues of the time. The contest over slavery had become so intense, it's really difficult to imagine how a president could have easily handled that, although Buchanan did a particularly poor job, often derided as the old public functionary. One of his main qualifications for president was he was gone. He was ambassador to the United Kingdom during the time of the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act covered in the previous lecture. He vetoed a lot of measures passed by Congress, such as a Homestead Act that would give free land to settlers in the frontier areas. Vetoed the Morrill Act, which both of these acts were to pass under Lincoln, but the Morrill Act, which would establish land grant colleges by giving federal land to states to establish colleges. There were also many no-bid contracts under his presidency. So we see, books here with the same title, Worst President Ever. There has been some rethinking, not a whole lot, but a little bit. There are certainly some people who think that Buchanan has been unduly maligned because of his homosexuality or victim of gay bashing. It's pretty clear that he was gay. He had a very more than a close friendship with William Rufus King. So here we have a book on the intimate world of these two bosom friends. Andrew Jackson mockingly called James Buchanan and William Rufus King Miss Nancy and Aunt Fancy. I mean, quite clearly an anti-gay slur. It is quite interesting, the sort of position of homosexuality at this time. It was obviously not acceptable at all. But if one was not openly proclaiming one's homosexual status, one could, if one were to stay in the closet, at least officially, one could do quite well, as both William Rufus King and James Buchanan did. In Buchanan's presidency, one of the biggest issue was not anything done by him as president or by Congress, but rather by the Supreme Court, and that was the 1857 Dred Scott decision, which essentially said black people cannot be U.S. citizens regardless of whether they're enslaved or not. The Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because Congress cannot ban slavery in the territories, and that the federal government was prohibited from freeing slaves brought into federal territory. So the supporters of slavery were elated, but opponents appalled, to say the least. And it really bolstered the nascent Republican Party, which is able to organize quite extensively over this issue, with slave hunters coming into the North and abducting black people. In the same year, there was another panic or economic downturn, the Panic of 1857. These occurred roughly every 20 years or so due to the so-called business cycle of overinvestment followed by retrenchment. Often there's something that sets them off. In a number of cases, it was the end of a war in Europe. In this case, the end of the Crimean War, which pit Britain and France against the Russian Empire. U.S. Did quite well often in European wars because the demand for agricultural goods and other products from the United States increased during wartime. And then when the war ends, there's a bit of retrenchment after that. This was also a period of massive investment in railroads, often over-investment and over-expansion, and as was constant during this period, excessive land speculation. Also, some scholars think a decline in the gold supply played a role. There had been a major increase in the gold supply with the California gold rush, but most of the easily worked placer deposits had been exhausted by this time, and when the U.S. was under pretty much a gold standard, that restricted the amount of currency available. Abraham Lincoln was the rising Republican star. He gained fame debating Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, very, very prominent Democratic senator. Douglas was the mastermind behind the idea of popular sovereignty, which was that the question of slavery in territories that had not yet become states would be decided by the voters, the white male voters of those regions. And the Missouri Compromise in 1820 had eliminated the possibility of slavery in the territories north of 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude. That's the southern border of Missouri. Missouri was brought into the country as a slave state, but areas at that same latitude further west were not to have slavery. And that had been undermined by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which sought popular sovereignty. But Lincoln had a series of debates. Lincoln was challenging Douglas for the Senate position in Illinois. He lost, but they debated all over the state. But this became a national issue. The extension of slavery into the Western territories was a huge national issue, and here were two very accomplished politicians and orators debating it. At this time, the telegraph allowed a very, very rapid, almost instantaneous transmission of information. So reporters would be transcribing the debate in shorthand, I believe. It would be sent off by the telegraph and then printed in newspapers all over the country. So that brought Lincoln to national attention. And then some scholars suggest that he sealed his nomination for the Republican candidacy in 1860 with an address at Cooper Union in New York, where he argued that the founding fathers would not have wanted the expansion of slavery into the West. He was not yet in favor of eliminating slavery. That's a position that would come somewhat later. It was considered too controversial. Good chance he wanted it, but wasn't open about it. Instead, the focus was on the expansion of slavery and slave power. But Lincoln was a very powerful orator and gained a lot of attention. Helping the Republican effort were groups of young men known as the Wide Awakes, and these were essentially marching clubs of young men, often described as paramilitary in organization, that be accompanied by bands in large numbers, marching in step and denouncing the expansion of slavery and supporting the Republican Party. They were hated and feared by Southern Democrats. One Democrat described them as 1/2 million of men uniformed and drilled, and the purpose of their organization to sweep the country in which I live with fire and swords. Quite an exaggeration. And the Democrats did respond by creating some of their own marching clubs. So it just tells you how tensions were heating up and would boil over quite soon. Well, after Lincoln wins the election in 1860, this is another four-way contest. The Democratic Party split in two branches. You can see John Breckinridge, second from the left, the Southern Democratic candidate from Kentucky, and Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's debating partner, senator from Illinois. And it was no surprise over the slavery issue. The Northern Democrats wanted popular sovereignty with voters to decide on the issue in the West, whereas the Southern Democrats were more in favor of just openly advocating the expansion of slavery. And then there, Lincoln obviously with the Republicans, and then from Tennessee, John Bell was the candidate of a new, very short-lived party called the Constitutional Union Party, which was based on the idea that it was essential to do everything possible to preserve the Union, and the issue of slavery should be put on the back burner, which was essentially impossible by this time. In the election, we see a very clearly geographically divided country. Also a huge turnout, 81.8% of eligible voters, the highest to date. But you could see Lincoln winning all the way across the North in the old Northwest, as well as the far West, California and Oregon, the only far Western states. The Southern Democrat Breckinridge sweeping the deep South and even some border states, including Delaware and Maryland, states that were not going to secede from the Union. And then Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, taking sort of the northern South, most of it anyway, Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Kentucky, especially Kentucky, but also Tennessee, it had a lot of Whig support, and the Whigs were an ancestral party to the Republican Party. And then Stephen Douglas, although he came in second in the popular vote, won only Missouri. I go back to an earlier slide. It's important to note the popular vote percentages. You can see with Lincoln winning with just under 40%, and then Douglas comes in second with just under 30%, with Breckinridge on only 18 and Bell at only 12.6. And one of that things that indicates is the growing demographic primacy of the North, and I'll show you some population maps of that later on. Looking at the geographical patterns by county, we see some very clear regional divisions here. You can see Douglas with the Northern Democrats doing very well in southern Illinois. That was an area that had been settled very heavily by people from the border states and had some sort of pro-South inclinations, whereas northern Illinois settled by people from New England, western New York, and other northern areas, very strongly Republican. Across the North, you can see strong Republican support, with some exceptions. And a number of those counties in the North that voted for Douglas were characterized, especially in the far North, were characterized by fairly large numbers of Catholic voters, many of them of German, Central European background. They tended to incline to the Democratic Party. In New York, we see something different. We see something called fusion, and that is a generic anti-Republican, well, not really party, but political movement. And the basic idea was, vote for, we're going to vote for anyone but Lincoln. The election of Lincoln would endanger the country, so this is something to be avoided. So if the fusion party, say, were to have won in New York, it would have given its electoral votes to whoever might have defeated Lincoln in the Electoral College. You can see this very clearly in a cartogram where we see the size of counties scaled by their population, and you could see how important New York City was at the time, and very clearly voted for New York City, and surrounding counties voted very, very clearly for the fusionist ticket, if you will. This was something we've seen before in earlier elections. New York had a large Irish immigrant population with other immigrants as well, and they tended to be aligned with the Democratic Party. Plus, it's essential to note how close the business connections were between New York and the South. So the South at this time was most of the South anyway, part of what was called the Cotton Kingdom, with cotton being the major agricultural product, most of which was exported to United Kingdom, to the cotton mills of Lancashire, where it was spun into yarn and then woven into cloth. That was the biggest industry at the time. It was the driver of the Industrial Revolution. And New York was, although obviously not in a cotton growing area, was a major center of cotton brokerage, cotton exports, close business connections with the South. And so that was another issue that sort of pushed it in that direction. New York City in this time was under the partial control of Tammany Hall, a political machine dominated by Irish immigrants and affiliated with the Democratic Party. If you look at the state as a whole, though, the Fusion Party did pretty well in New York City, southern New York, up into the Hudson River Valley as well. But in most of those counties where it did win, was with 50 to 60%, whereas Lincoln won the West and most of the North by higher percentages, especially that so-called burned-over district of Western New York, as I mentioned before, burned over by the fires of evangelical fervor in the Second Great Christian Awakening in the early 1800s. And I did point out here Hamilton County, very strongly anti-Lincoln. You can see over 70%, the strongest. But this is still to this day the least densely populated country east of the Mississippi. It's in the Adirondack Mountains. It only had a couple thousand people at the time, so it was not demographically significant. So as we all know, the South secedes. Not all slave states. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland were slave states but did not secede. Virginia had its own secession movement, whereas the western counties did not secede from the Union and then went on to form the separate state of West Virginia. The other thing we could see is the secession started in South Carolina and spread initially in the far south and cotton, especially in cotton-growing areas, whereas the more northern South or states more in the border category, North Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Virginia seceded later. There was quite a bit of reluctance to do so. Remember from a previous map that the Constitutional Union Party had won in Virginia and in Tennessee. Tennessee itself might have divided over the same issue, just like Virginia did, because the western areas of the eastern areas of the state were vehemently opposed to secession, especially the northeast. So on the map above, the blue counties voted against secession in a referendum that the state had, whereas the more red the county is, the more it voted in favor. And then I have a map showing the percentage of the population that was enslaved black people. The darker, the higher the percentage. And there's a pretty good correlation. It's not perfect by any means, but areas that had relatively large enslaved populations, meaning that they had plantation-based economies and a wealthy, essentially aristocratic planter class, tended to vote quite heavily for secession, whereas states that were dominated by relatively poor white farmers tended to vote very much against secession. And this pattern is going to continue for decades, and we will continue to see it. So anyway, with the South gone out of Congress, the Republicans are in control and are able to push through much of their agenda. So things like the Homestead Act, giving land for free in western frontier areas once it's taken from the indigenous inhabitants, obviously. But if they're going to cultivate it, they're not going to have to pay for it, which had always been the norm. The Moral Land Grant college bill passed bills for internal improvement, like supporting railway construction, passed as well. And eventually, also the elimination of slavery. Well, that was actually abolished by the Emancipation Proclamation, which happens in 1863. So by this time, Lincoln felt he had enough power to push that through. It only applied, though, to states that had seceded. It didn't even apply to Tennessee because that had already been taken over by Union troops. But then shortly afterwards, an amendment of the Constitution is going to be passed and slavery is eliminated everywhere. In 1864, when the year began, Lincoln was not confident of his chance of being reelected. The war was starting to go better for the North. It went quite poorly in the early years. Really started to turn in 1863. But even in 1864, there was a lot of opposition. Northern Democrats wanted a ceasefire and a negotiated settlement, basically let the South secede. The Northern Democrats nominated George McClellan, who was Lincoln's most important general in the early war. Lincoln fired him essentially for not fighting hard enough and not taking the war to the South the way Lincoln wanted him to. McClellan was himself, although a Northerner, was generally pro-slavery and very deeply racist by the standards, even by the standards of the time. Also, McClellan had come to hate Lincoln. No, they came to hate each other. And this quotation is rather striking, where McClellan said, "The president," meaning Lincoln, "is no more than a well-meaning baboon. I went to the White House directly after tea, where I found the original gorilla, about as intelligent as ever. What a specimen to be at the head of our affairs now." Well, Lincoln was often mocked for his appearance, very rugged face, and so he was insulted as a baboon or a gorilla. It's rather staggering to me, though, that his intelligence would be challenged in this way. If you look at his speeches, which he wrote himself, or certainly wrote the Gettysburg Address, and the intelligence is crystal clear. But as is so often the case in heated political debates, the truth tends to slip away. So anyway, Lincoln, in early 1864, he thought he would lose. McClellan had a lot of support. There were anti-draft riots in New York. The war was incredibly expensive and incredibly bloody. I mean, it was just a vicious war. And also, he was almost challenged from the left by John C. Fremont, the previous Republican candidate in 1856. And Fremont wanted a more radically, a ticket propounding sort of a more radical or more thoroughly democratic approach, if you will. So Fremont representing the left wing of the Republican Party. But Fremont decided not to do this. The war started to go much better. The South was obviously being defeated. And Lincoln won pretty handily, although you can see 55 to 44%. McClellan took only New Jersey and Kentucky. Louisiana and Tennessee were back under federal control, and they did vote. They voted for McClellan, but their votes were not counted. They had not been readmitted to the Union yet. Now, if you look at the county map, you can see quite a few areas of Democratic support for McClellan. Not surprising in border states like Kentucky and Maryland, but also a lot in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, one in New Jersey, New York City, Hudson Valley, northern New Hampshire, southern Illinois, some places in the far north. There are very sparsely populated counties up there, some of the German Catholic areas in Wisconsin. One thing I found really notable was on this map, one is you can see gray areas in West Virginia, so an area that has seceded from Virginia to remain a state, did not secede. But no vote counted in some of the counties in Kentucky, too. There's basically guerrilla war here because there were partisans of the South who wanted to secede, who were fighting against those who wanted to stay. And in some nearby counties in West Virginia again, and also in the Ozark Plateau of southwestern Missouri, a major shift to the Republican Party. And a lot of this was anger over supporters of the Confederacy. These were all areas that had been part of slave states. and those who wanted to secede and to join the Confederacy were fighting against those who wanted to stay in the Union. And anger over that and the violence that came from it led to this real sharp shift. And the Ozark Plateau is going to remain Republican voting for decades afterwards. You can also see an area in eastern Kentucky, similar sort of thing. So as we all know, Lincoln was assassinated in April of, 1865, mistake on the slide, and was replaced by his War Democrat Vice President, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. So Johnson was one of the only members of Congress from the seceding states who remained loyal to the Union. So by War Democrat, that meant he was loyal to the Democratic Party, but did want to fight the Confederacy and bring them back into the Union. One of the people who had been part of that constitutional Union movement, but he still was not a proponent of abolition of slavery by any means. So he opposed reconstruction of the South, where the federal government would come and take control and change political and social order. He was opposed to civil rights for freed slaves, and vetoed many bills passed by Congress. So he was impeached but not convicted, remained president, but very, very unpopular. So in the next election, 1868, the Republicans turned to General Ulysses S. Grant, who had not been a Republican in the early period. I believe he did not vote for Lincoln in 1860, but he was the most important Union general who eventually was given the main command and was very successful in that regard. So this is a part of the very common pattern of parties picking popular generals. I mean, we saw this in the pre-Civil War period with, Andrew Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor. There are a number of generals who are going to be nominated after the Civil War, and we can go all the way up to Dwight Eisenhower. And it's interesting, a number of them were of sort of uncertain political affiliation. That was certainly true of Eisenhower. At one point, the Democrats thought maybe we should nominate him, and they didn't even know what party he belonged to. That was true of Zachary Taylor with the Whig candidate as well. But anyway, Grant is nominated. The Democrats accuse the Republicans of favoring black or Negro supremacy. Blacks were now allowed to vote, but there was so much violence, and Georgia and Louisiana especially, perpetrated by the Ku Klux Klan. The blacks were effectively disenfranchised and were not able to vote. Although in areas where black people were the overwhelming majority, that even though there was violence there as well, that was not enough to keep them away from the ballot box. They were very eager to vote. And so you can see Grant winning most of the southern states, losing only Louisiana and Georgia. Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas had not yet been readmitted to the Union, so no vote there. It's really interesting to look at Alabama in this election. And you could see on the two maps there, the one on the right showing the percent enslaved, and you could see a number of counties, over 80% of the people had been enslaved people. And then the Republican vote in red. So it's very clear it's, in most of Alabama, it's the former slaves who are voting for the Republican Party, which was seen as their party that freed them. There's a very interesting exception, a county called Winston County, which had hardly any enslaved people at all. It was in an area of relatively poor soil, dominated by poor white farmers. They were vehemently opposed to the plantation aristocracy and the whole slave system, and voted very heavily for President Grant and the Republicans. One thing that I find really curious, and I don't really have a good answer though, is there are many counties nearby Winston that had very similar circumstances. You could see neighboring counties, one to the south, one immediately to the east, with similarly low numbers of enslaved people, but yet they voted for the Democratic Party. some of the other ones in northern Alabama with very few slaves also voted for the Republican Party, but not to the extent of Winston County. People of Winston County were very proud of this. They called their county the Free State of Winston. They opposed secession, voted to remain neutral, and remained proud of that for a long time. And there's even here's a park opened in 1954 advocating the telling the story of the Free State of Winston. It's interesting in politics, political geography. Some things stay the same and some things change. One thing that has changed is the political geography of the state in terms of voting pattern. That's partly because the parties have changed so much on issues of civil rights. But you can see, compare the map of 1868 and 2020, and they're almost inverse with blue and red switching places. So that so-called black belt across south central Alabama, named after its rich black soils, the main plantation zone. Rural counties here still have black majorities, and they vote very heavily with the Democratic Party. But you can see Winston, having been one of the few white-dominated Republican voting counties in 1868, has stayed true to the Republican Party, even though the Republican Party has changed very significantly on civil rights and has lost most of its black support, although it's gaining some of it back now. But it actually had the highest vote for Donald Trump in 2020 in the state of Alabama. The Democratic candidate running against Grant, Horatio Seymour, was somewhat moderate, at least compared to his running mate Francis Blair, who was from Missouri, former slave state, and shared the racist proclivities of many, not all by any means, but many Missouri whites. He warned of the rule of, quote, a semi-barbarous race of blacks who are worshippers of fetishes and polygamists, and who wanted to subject white women to their unbridled lusts, sort of classic racist stereotypes. And some historians have suggested that this may have cost Seymour the election, because it was a close election. I mean, if we can go back to that election, you could see in terms of the Electoral College, it wasn't so close, but in terms of the popular vote, 52.7 to 47.3, not narrow, but not particularly wide either. The Republican platform in 1868 called for full citizenship for black people, for a radical reconstruction of the South to change its political and social system, encouraged immigration. So relative, quite liberal for the standards of the time. The big question is whether Grant himself was a liberal, and many would argue no. And actually, as a Civil War leader, when he had authority over the western region, his General Order 11 called for the expulsion of all Jews from his military district. He accused Jewish merchants of illicitly trading in Confederate goods. That order didn't go into effect. It was rescinded by Lincoln, but it tells you something about Grant. And Grant has been much criticized. Now, Grant, though, is now being reconsidered. You can see on the bottom illustration here the redemption of Ulysses S. Grant. Yeah, as a Union general, Grant expelled Jews from his war zone. Well, he tried to. But when he becomes president, he helps usher in a brief golden age in the history of the American Jewish community. I haven't gone further into that. But then more recently in the New York Review of Books, in just October 17th of 2024, an article on Grant versus the Klan, a review of several books discussing the fact that Grant was a forceful defender of the civil rights of African Americans after the Civil War, and fought against the very violent Ku Klux Klan of the era. Grant's biggest problem was a different one. His administration was widely regarded as corrupt. There are big debates over whether the corruption sort of extended to Grant or how far it did. This political cartoon shows him as an acrobat held aloft by a whiskey ring and a navy ring, and carrying his cronies with a strap marked corruption. So he was certainly surrounded by a lot of corrupt people. He was a brilliant general, no doubt about it. His critics have said he failed at most other endeavors, but like I said, there's some reconsideration. There's also a lot of rumors that he was an alcoholic. He seems to have had problems with drinking. He sometimes engaged in binge drinking, but there were other periods when he didn't drink at all. So there's some reconsideration of that. What is more clear, though, that his vice president, Schuyler Colfax, was involved in a lot of corruption. And a rather amazing political cartoon from the period depicts Colfax and his fellows in the garb of Japanese samurai. And you have Uncle Sam here urging him to commit harakiri or seppuku, ritual disembowelment. It's a pretty accurate depiction of Japanese dress. We see Uncle Sam pointing at a short sword that is to be used for the disemboweling, and you can see somebody behind him with a longer sword, which will be used to decapitate him. And this is for crimes of corruption in office and accepting bribes and perjury and so on. So the charge of corruption, or charges of corruption, hangs heavily over the next election, that of 1872. And this is actually one of the most interesting and bizarre elections in U.S. history, because there was a major split in the Republican Party. A number of Republicans bolted the party and formed a new party called the Liberal Republican Party. These were, in general, the more moderate wings of the Republican Party, more moderate in terms of the question of civil rights and of reconstruction of the South, but also the more high-minded faction that were more concerned about corruption. And the Democrats decided that they would not have their own candidate. They would, in order to win the election and defeat Grant in his quest for a second term, the Democrats would join with the liberal Republicans. And the liberal Republicans and with their Democratic allies, Republicans anyway, nominated Horace Greeley, a very well-known newspaper publisher, author, and public intellectual, if you will. Greeley was quite old at the time. It was very stressful. He was subjected to extremely harsh criticism, and he actually died before the Electoral College met. So that's why the Electoral College map shows a lot of different individuals here. But Grant wins handily, a larger popular vote gain, 55.6 to 43.8, and takes essentially has a landslide in the Electoral College. So we need now to consider a little bit the interesting and unusual career of Horace Greeley. He was very much an eccentric person, brilliant, no doubt, quite vain. At least many of his critics certainly thought so. He was a publisher, editor, and founder of the New York Tribune, an important paper. He was a very dedicated social reformer. He was extolling only self-help and free enterprise, but he also supported at different times, all sorts of ideas that were way outside of the mainstream, from utopian socialism, sexual and dietary reforms like vegetarianism, not exactly popular at the time, alcohol prohibition. Lincoln is reported to have said, it's not clear if he really did, but supposedly said, Greeley is like a man trying to ride several horses at once, supporting every ism known to man. And there was a little bit of flipping and flopping, no doubt about it, as this editorial cartoon shows, with Greeley eating his own words and deeds. So Greeley had been vehemently anti-slavery and opposed the expansion of slavery and even just the institution itself. But he turned against Reconstruction. He wanted peace between the North and South. There was a tremendous amount of antagonism. Reconstruction was not at all an easy process. There were a lot of Northerners known as carpetbaggers who went down to make money in the defeated South. They were accused of all sorts of unseemly acts. Certainly the Southerners did not like them. So anyway, Greeley wanted more peaceful relations between the two main regions of the country. He actually bailed out Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. So many liberal Republicans who were part of this sort of new offshoot faction that nominated him, they turned against him. As one said, why turn out a knave, meaning Grant, just to replace him with a fool? Greeley's appearance didn't help. Well, this is obviously a caricature, but he was rather, his dress and comportment was somewhat unusual. I'd also note that he was very quotable. His best known line is, "Go west, young man, go west, and grow up with the country." Some of his quotations make him seem like a hardcore Christian fundamentalist, like it's impossible to enslave mentally or socially a Bible-reading people. The principles of the Bible are the groundwork of human freedom. Yet he also said there is no doctrine in Christianity but has been anticipated by the Vedas being the oldest sacred literature of Hinduism. So, an interesting person, no doubt. Probably Carl Schurz, who was usually considered the actual founding figure of the liberal Republican Party, would have been a better candidate. He was precluded because he was German. He actually fought against the Prussian army in the failed liberal revolution of 1848. Revolution spread up all over much of Europe, especially Central Europe and Germany. Revolutions trying to overthrow established aristocracies and monarchies and move towards more Republican democratic forms of governance. Defeated, he flees to the United States. He becomes a Union general in the Civil War and remains a consistent reformer and political actor through the rest of his life. You see, he's become Secretary of the Interior later on. Schurz is from Missouri, and it's not coincidental because there was a major area of German settlement called the Missouri Rhineland. I have the map here on the left from the Wikipedia on it, which I think is showing too large of an area, really. But I note here in the headline of this slide, the title, that Central Missouri has a very interesting dual settlement legacy, because much of the area in the central part of the South, as known as Little Dixie, had been settled by Southerners, and this was the main area of plantation agriculture and enslavement in Missouri, mostly tobacco and hemp growing. And the two areas look like they're sort of the same, but if you look closely, the core area of German settlement in the eastern part of that region is just to the south or southeast of the heart of Little Dixie. And then later, I'll show you some maps where you can really see these two areas where the core region of the Rhineland that in the eastern part became a real Republican stronghold, whereas the core of Little Dixie very much a Democratic stronghold for decades to come. Moving on to the last election I'm going to cover in this lecture is that of 1876, and this is one of the most shambolic and consequential elections in U.S. history. So both candidates nominate very respectable, highly accomplished candidates. The Republicans choose Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio, a swing state at the time. But they didn't actually campaign on a whole lot. Both of them claimed to be reformers. Well, both of them were wanting to fight against corruption, which was a big issue. So Hayes, the Republican, promised honest and efficient government. He advocated civil service reform, and he pledged to ease up on the reconstruction of the South, which was becoming increasingly unpopular, highly unpopular in the South, but also in the North as well. And the Democrats nominated Samuel Tilden of New York, a millionaire corporate lawyer, one of the richest people of the country. He was also a reformer. He was an opponent of Tammany Hall. I'm sorry, I'm missing one L in that word. But also an opponent of corruption in general. And he denounced carpetbagger tyranny, in other words, the role of northern merchants who had gone south to profit by, or some would say exploit, the hapless southerners. So it was not an issue where civil rights, not an election where civil rights were at the forefront, far from it. One thing that Tilden and the Democrats campaigned against were federal railroad land grants. So under Republican leadership, The Republicans very much in favor of national integration, infrastructural development, using the federal government to encourage the development of the leading form of transportation at the time, railroads. So under Congress, huge land grants were given to the railways, basically public land. Some of it was still controlled by indigenous nations, although they're being defeated and dispossessed precisely at this time in the Great Plains region, at any rate. But some very, very wide swaths of land, public land. This was given to the railways. The idea was the railways could sell it off to settlers. That would lead to more economic development. The population would grow. That would make the railways more profitable to have more people in these regions, although a lot of these areas were too dry or too rugged for very much settlement. Most of them, at least in the intermontane region, were. Now, these railway land grants were not those entire strips. Rather, they were given in a checkerboard pattern, every other section, a section being a square mile. So you'd have this checkerboard where the federal government would retain every other section, and then in those pink strips, every other section would go to the railways. You can still see this pattern, not just on maps, but even from the air. So here's a map from a site called Amusing Planet Checkerboard Forest. Pull up a Google map and look at forested areas in the western United States, and you'll notice some strange checkerboard patterns like the one below. And what this aerial photograph shows is different land ownership. I don't know who owns the land in this particular image, but you can see every other section has been cut. It will grow back to forest, but most of these areas have been clear cut by whoever owned them, and then the sections in between still forested. Very interesting pattern. If you spend time with, say, hunters in Montana, most of whom are hunting on public land, National Forest land, Bureau of Land Management land. Often it's this situation where the Forest Service only has every other section, and the rest others are private. And so you want to go from one section of public ownership to another, you have to cross at the corner, so you need good GPS. People who don't like this will say, well, that corner is just one single point, and a person covers more than a point, so you cannot go from one section to another. So it's a very heated issue. And I will note that my former colleague at Stanford University Department of History, now retired Richard White, a very eminent historian and scholar, wrote a very controversial but in general quite well received by the scholarly community at any rate, book called Railroaded, The Transcontinentals and the Making of Modern America. And just to quote the blurb from Amazon, the transcontinental railroads were the first corporate behemoths. Their attempt to generate profits from proliferating debt sparked devastating economic panics. Their dependence on public largesse drew them into the corridors of power, initiating new forms of corruption. Their operations rearranged space and time, remade the landscape of the West, and opened new ways of life and work. Their discriminatory rate sparked a new anti-monopoly politics. It's hard to disagree with that. A lot of these railways, some of them were profitable, but a lot of them in the more sparsely populated areas were not, and they depended on this huge amount of gifts of land, essentially, from the federal government, which in the long run may not have been beneficial. Putting transcontinental railways in general, I think it's hard to argue that those were not beneficial, but that wasn't true of all the railways that went in by any means. So in this election of 1876, the Democrat, the millionaire corporate lawyer Samuel Tilden from New York, wins the popular vote. And he wins it, by a couple percentage points. So it's not a super close election by any means. But if you look at the final electoral vote there, the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes won by one electoral vote. And it was an election where there were a lot of disputed electoral votes. Now there was one from Oregon. It was a different matter in Oregon. It had to do with one elector being a postmaster general, which was not the way things were supposed to work. But anyway, the big issues were South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, where the Republicans won, and Democrats accused the Republicans of all sorts of shenanigans. I won't go into the details of this. There was a congressional committee established to determine where the votes go. The Republicans dominate that, and all those disputed votes go to the Republicans, which allow Rutherford B. Hayes to come to office just by one electoral vote. It's often regarded as another corrupt bargain, harkening back to the 1824 election, where John Quincy Adams gets the electoral vote. And well, you can watch the previous lecture if you're interested in that. But the deal made here was that Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican, he gets all those disputed electoral votes, but then agrees basically to bring an end to Reconstruction of the South, to let the white population dictate future terms, and to begin a gradual process of disenfranchisement of the black population. It didn't happen immediately, but it starts gradual process, and by the end of the century, blacks in most of the South do not have voting rights anymore. That's stripped away from them. So there was a lot of anger about this election. Hayes was called Rutherford B. Hayes, or his fraudulency, and it led to a lot of cynicism about the process. And this is really, we're now transitioning to a new phase when the reforming ideas of the Republican Party, their real push for more equitable racial relations and enfranchisement of blacks, that's starting to come to an end. It doesn't happen immediately, but this election marks a turning point. It's also really interesting to look at the county map, how stark the voting pattern was. In much of the South, or you can see some very red areas in the South, and those are basically areas where the black population was so large that even with all the Klan's violence, black people were still voting in pretty large numbers, and that's going to diminish now, election by election. But you can see the area along the Mississippi River, large area of South Carolina, for example. But outside of that, in areas with white population, although Winston County in Alabama still stands out as red, but most of those white-dominated areas in the South, it's like 80, 90, 100% vote for Tilden. And for Hayes, we have not quite such huge majorities, but there are some areas, especially up in Minnesota, with equally overwhelming landslides. And in fact, if you look at the color scheme, with the darkest category for Tilden and the darkest category from Hayes, become kind of hard to distinguish that dark red from the dark blue. But you can kind of tell just by what part of the country they're found in. California is an interesting case. By counties, California looks quite evenly divided, but it wasn't. It went for Hayes quite handily. And it's partly because the population density at the time was quite unlike the population density today. Mostly because Southern California had a relatively few people. You can see Los Angeles County, well, what is now Los Angeles County and Orange County, blue on that map. But the population concentration was in the Bay Area and into Sacramento County, and even a little bit further east in some of the gold mining counties. And that Bay Area, and especially Sacramento, very heavily Republican voting. And the gold mining counties immediately to the east in the Sierra Nevada foothills, it's interesting that the southern ones were Democratic voting and the northern ones were Republican voting. And that largely depends on where the miners came from, because there were a lot of, in the gold rush, a lot of miners came from the south, a lot came from the north, and they had different percentages, as that was one of the issues. I want to just have a couple more maps, just two more, but I want to note here some of the interesting county level patterns we could see. So I've circled an area, I put an oval around an area in northeastern Tennessee and adjoining areas of Kentucky with very heavy voting for the Republican Party. I've noted this previously. But then you go into a similar area further north in Western Virginia and parts of West Virginia with very, very little Republican voting. And a lot of this reflects state level politics because the counties are organized the parties are organized not just on a national level, but especially at a state level. So in Tennessee, you had these areas in that sort of Appalachian Ridge and Valley region, especially with very heavy Republican voting patterns, voting against the more established areas of power in the center and western part of the states, where in Appalachian part of Virginia and West Virginia, it had a different state level dynamics. That's one of the reasons why you see this very distinctive pattern. And then finally, I want to note the other presidential vote in this election. It only goes up to over 6%, but it's going to really increase. And the main other party here was a party called the Greenback Party. It was a new party. By greenbacks, they mean paper money not directly tied to precious metals, gold or silver. So paper money at the time existed, but it would be redeemable in precious metal. What the Greenback Party wanted was to kind of untie the currency from the store of precious metal, because especially gold was in relatively short supply. That meant there was deflationary pressure, and deflationary pressure put a huge burden on debtors. And a lot of farmers, especially in the more western areas, were suffering from a lot of debt. A lot of this had to do with bad harvests from negative weather conditions. It was also tied in with the railway monopolies and the very high rates they charged, both to bring in goods and to take out goods. And so there was growing opposition to railway monopolies, and there was the most important monopolies, opposition to the gold standard, and advocating paper currency and debt relief. And in the next couple decades, this is going to become a larger and larger movement. And in 1896, it's this same sort of movement is essentially going to take over the Democratic Party, and the Democratic Party is going to have this huge shift in that election. But before we get to that very important election of 1896, we're going to talk about the intervening elections, 1880, 84, 88, and 92. And those elections will be the subject of the next lecture. So thank you for listening, and I hope you can tune in to the next Geocurrents lecture on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections.